The night over Rome grows thicker, as if the city itself were inhaling its last breath. The wind smells of burned wax, of incense snuffed out, of smoke from 100 hearths gone cold. From the vault of heaven fall not soft rain, but streaks of fire, meteors that tear through darkness like portents hurled by an angry sky. You stand on the forum. Marble glows in the ember light. Statues throw long shadows. The city's breath is visible in the cold air. And yet something fragile vibrates beneath that splendor. A rumor, a whisper, a pattern of signs people refuse to ignore. For centuries, Rome read meaning in the world around it. Birds, stars, the shape of a sacrificial liver. Now those messages pile up, ominous and insistent. When omens multiply, the story they tell becomes harder to deny. In Rome's late centuries, it is tempting to speak of armies and emperors and forget that before all military campaigns and senatorial decrees, a civilization listened. It listened to augurs and haruspices, to the murmur of the Tiber, and to the cries of street vendors. Omens were not mere superstition, they were an ancient grammar for making sense of fate. A comet, a rain of frogs, a statue that seemed to weep. Each was a sentence in a conversation between men and gods. The augurs could halt a law with a single sign. The flight of birds could reorder politics. The liver of a sacrificed animal could be read as clean or corrupt, promising victory or death. These rituals sustained the idea that the cosmos and the city were in dialogue. But ritual presupposes faith, and faith frays when your granaries are empty, when gold is clipped, when borders leak. In the 4th and 5th centuries, the portents change tone. They stop being isolated curiosities and become a chorus. Chroniclers record fiery spears across the sky, whole nights lit by falling stars. Ammianus Marcellinus, writing with the clarity of an eyewitness and the imagination of an ancient Roman, described such celestial fires that left men trembling and priests scrambling for meaning. To someone who believed the gods wrote in the heavens, meteor showers looked like messages inked with flame. Across the provinces, rivers ran red, or so the account goes, and people cast offerings into reddened currents, thinking to staunch the bleeding earth with sacrifice. In Campania and Liguria, farmers reported rains that stung like brimstone. Leaves burned black overnight. A statue reputed to shed tears was no longer merely a curiosity for the pious, it became a headline for a populace already bent by hunger and fear. Coincidence? For a society that made order out of ritual, coincidence was a failure of interpretation, a short circuit between cause and meaning. And interpretation is political. When priests read ruin into the sky, those readings prompt action. New laws, canceled festivals, emergency levies. But they also prompt panic. The more omens, the more the public imagines calamity as inevitable. Consider the men who sat at the empire's helm. When Julian the Apostate prepared his ill-fated campaign against Persia, his priests laid out a verdict. The sacrificial liver was marred, malformed. In the world of ritual, that was an executioner's note. Julian rode east and fell by a spear. Coincidence? Perhaps, but the image is potent. A ruler sent to test fate and then summarily judged by the same ritual language his office depended upon. The sack of Rome in 410 by Alaric's Visigoths is the scene historians return to. It is a military catastrophe and a cultural rupture, but it is also the climax of a pattern of portents. Chroniclers and letter writers speak of strange cries at night, of crows congregating on temple roofs, of lights in the sky that resembled torches or spectral armaments. Augustine, in City of God, writes his defense of the Christian order in the wake of these events, a text meant to answer the spiritual questions the sack raised. For contemporaries, the fall felt less like an accident than the final line of a long prophecy. Yet portents are not only visible phenomenon. They are bodies and voices and grotesque births. Imperial scribes preserved reports of children born with deformities, of two-headed calves and malformed lambs, signs once seen as Jupiter's displeasure with human affairs. In Liguria, rain with a sulfurous reek burned the skin. In southern Italy, people reported subterranean voices issuing warnings. The Catalogue of Wonders reads like a nightmare diary, each entry another nail on Rome's coffin in the public imagination. How did rulers respond? First, with ritual. More sacrifices, doubled offerings, public supplications. The imperial machine knew the choreography: placate the gods, calm the people, maintain order. But ritual costs money, and the state had growing trouble producing that money. Minting debased coinage, draining treasuries for frontier defense, the empire could no longer buy the quiet that sacrificial ceremonies once purchased. Then something else happens. The readings are hushed. Where omens had once been broadcast to the populace, emperors in the late empire often had signs and their interpretations confined to palace ears. Why hide what once was declared? Because panic eats the foundations of rule faster than the sword. When the public believes the gods pronounce doom, they are less inclined to back new levies, to follow generals, or to accept austere reforms. Silence, then, becomes a political instrument. Conceal the ominous, preserve authority. That silence is revealing. Rome's institutions, rituals, magistracies, priestly colleges, had functioned as meaning makers for centuries. When the state stopped translating signs for the people, it admitted one of two things: that it had no answer worth offering, or that the rulers feared the answer would destroy them politically. The result was a vacuum of meaning, at the very moment meaning was most needed. The figure of Nero haunts this narrative. Tacitus and other moralizing historians emphasize his theatricality, performances and spectacles more than governance, as evidence of a ruler who turned away from Roman gravitas. Whether Nero's stagecraft directly caused decline is doubtful. The point is rhetorical. Behavior becomes proof of decline. Later, Elagabalus is painted by hostile sources as the caricature of imperial excess: Eastern rites, sexual rumors, gaudy robes, and with such portraits, the chroniclers deliver a moral lesson. Deviance from established norms equals rot at the top. Satirists and poets wielded a different power. Juvenal and Martial did not command troops, but their verses shaped perception. A scornful line about a senator's softness could echo longer and more persuasively than an imperial edict. In the baths and markets, satire petrified rumor into reputational death. Rhetoric, in other words, could function as siegecraft. Once the people accept a ruler's moral failure, political collapse accelerates. Consider the practical shifts that made panic more dangerous. The Roman military had evolved from citizen legions to a reliance on federate troops and foederati, Germanic contingents settled within imperial borders. These soldiers were often loyal to their leaders or their pay rather than to the res publica. Economic strain, a shrinking tax base, and plagues like the Cyprian affliction in the 3rd century had already hollowed out reserves. Under such conditions, a wave of omens could be the spark that turned a fragile political consensus into open defection. The sack of 410 was not the first time barbarians had taken Rome, but it was the first time in living memory that the Eternal City was breached by a barbarian army that lingered. Alaric had spent years as both ally and enemy, a foederatus turned foe by disappointment and hunger for recognition. The imperial court at Ravenna, where Honoria sheltered, was a symbol of a divided administration. Rome itself had become a symbolic target. Take the city, and you take a claim to legitimacy.
For citizens primed by portents, the sight of foreign troops in the streets fulfilled the ominous narrative they already believed. Could the omens have been averted? If Rome had been economically healthy, politically coherent, and spiritually unified, perhaps auguries could be marshaled to restore confidence. But the empire in late antiquity was beset by multiple ills: currency debasement, land concentration undermining free peasantry, internal rebellions, the administrative costs of defending long frontiers, and the cultural shifts of a Christianizing polity debating its own relation to former ritual forms. Omens were accelerants, not primary causes. Yet the role of omens illustrates a timeless truth. Political authority depends on narratives. Empires are stories as much as machines. Rituals, prophets, and public ceremonies are the grammar and vocabulary of those stories. When the grammar fails or becomes suspect, the story fractures. Rome's last centuries reveal an empire struggling to keep coherence between its words and its actions. The heavens cried out, the priests misread, the rulers feared, the people panicked. There are rare and striking details that complicate the tale. In some regions, local bishops took on roles once reserved for pagan priests, blessing grain and organizing relief, an early example of religious authority stepping into the breach. Augustine's City of God is not simply a theology, it's political damage control, a manual for reweaving civic meaning in a world where the old oracles and omens no longer offered comforting answers. Meanwhile, some provincial leaders used omens to bolster resistance, turning prophecy into motivation for defense rather than surrender. The signs were polyvalent. Their power rested in how humans used them. Think, too, of the human detail. Families that watched candles gutter as the omens increased. Bankers who hoarded coin because they expected markets to crash. Soldiers who felt less certain of their commanders after the ritual verdicts went wrong. The history is not only about generals and emperors. It is about the granular mechanics of trust. Trust between ruler and ruled, trust between city and provinces, trust in institutions meant to interpret the world. When trust erodes, even the most dazzling ceremonies become hollow spectacle. And still, portents fascinate because they force a confrontation with contingency. In a modern age, we smirk at comet madness and ritual theater, yet we also live by signs, statistics, polls, stock tickers, all forms of divination for our time. When market indicators flash red, when polls tumble, when social media amplifies panic, we see contemporary equivalents of Rome's ominous signals. The medium changes, the psychology remains. So what is the lesson the city teaches across centuries? Empires crumble through accumulated fractures: economic pressure, institutional decay, military reconfiguration, and cultural transformation. But there is also a second lesson, subtler and more dangerous. When people begin to interpret ordinary events as cosmic verdicts, they surrender deliberation to narrative. Decisions become reactions to omen, not calculated policy. In such a climate, leaders are no longer architects, but firemen trying to quench rumor with proclamation. Rome's decline is not a single tragedy, nor a single moral. It is a sequence of failures to translate events into effective action and convincing story. The gods, whether real powers or collective metaphors, seemed to speak. The state, increasingly mute or evasive, could not provide a counter-voice that restored confidence. Panic metastasized. Today, as we read the chronicles of Ammianus, Orosius, Augustine, or the terse entries in the Chronicon, the portents feel like lies and truths braided together. They are historical data and human drama. They show us that political resilience depends on both resources and meaning. If the city could not keep its rituals alive in a way that comforted citizens, if it could not convert ritual into credible policy, then no amount of walls or gold would suffice. We can close with a final thought. Signs do not decide fate alone. People do. An omen becomes fate when a society decides to treat it as law. Rome's story is therefore not only about falling stones or weeping statues, it is about the choices men made when the stars seemed to turn against them. Those choices, to hush, to fear, to fight, to flee, shaped the arc of an empire and left us a lesson about how fragile the scaffolding of human order really is. Whatever the ancient chronicles truly reported, Rome teaches a simple lesson. Empires die not from a single cause, but from many small fissures. And when stars, birds, and rivers begin to whisper, we still have time, if we choose to hear and to change course. The end.